Every time the US Federal Reserve adjusts interest rates, the global economy shakes. In the first 10 days of 2016 alone, $2.5 trillion evaporated from the global stock market, with US stocks alone accounting for $1.8 trillion. Many economists have warned that the global economy is approaching the edge of a crisis. Financial crises have been linked to the US Federal Reserve's Fed interest rate hikes. The most recent cycle from 2004 to 2006 saw the Fed raising interest rates, which increased the risk of subprime mortgages in the US, leading to the 2008 financial crisis. 1. Interest rate cycle 1980-1998 to 1986. In June 1981, the Fed raised interest rates to 20% and reduced issuance from 12.5% to 1.1% by 1986. Inflation was pushed back. However, this rate hike cycle triggered the public debt crisis in Latin American countries during the 1980s, considered the first public debt crisis in modern economic history. The crisis began in Mexico in 1982 when the country defaulted, followed by most countries in the region falling into the spiral. Argentina in 1982, 1989, Bolivia 1980, 1986, 1989, Brazil 1983, 1986, 1987, and Ecuador 1982, 1984. Because was there excessive borrowing of cheap USD from the US when the Fed raised interest rates? These countries defaulted. 2. Interest rate cycle 199 for 1997. The late 1980s saw monetary easing lowering loan interest rates and financial liberalization in the US, Europe, and Japan, resulting in excessive global liquidity. Investors in these major financial centers sought to diversify their portfolios by investing abroad, as domestic investments offered low interest rates. Meanwhile, Asian countries implemented capital account liberalization. Interest rates in Asia were higher than in developed countries. Consequently, international capital flowed massively into Asia to take advantage of higher interest rates. From 1990 to 1997, private capital inflows into developing countries increased fivefold, from $42 billion to $256 billion. East Asia attracted a large portion of this capital, accounting for 60% of total inflows. Due to insufficient controls, many Asian economies became overly dependent on highly volatile external financial sources, primarily short-term loans. By the end of 1996, East Asian countries owed $318 billion to European banks, $260 billion to Japanese banks, and $46 billion to US banks, mostly in short-term loans under 1 year. In 1994, the Fed doubled interest rates from 3% to 6% annually. By 1997, US speculators employed short-selling strategies that caused stock markets from Thailand to South Korea, from Indonesia to Hong Kong to collapse. The crisis resulted in approximately $3 trillion in losses for Asia. 3. Interest rate cycle 200 for 2007. After the Asian financial crisis, the Fed maintained ultra-low interest rates of around 1% for a prolonged period. During this time, countries amassed debt at an alarming rate, estimated at around $55 trillion. Whether borrowed in the US or abroad, debts were denominated in USD. The dollarization of debt allowed the Fed to have ample opportunities to print abundant USD, meeting global liquidity demands. By 2002, the Fed began raising interest rates to 2.5%, and by 2004, to 5.5%. This triggered a subprime mortgage crisis. This crisis resulted in approximately $1.2 trillion in losses, but the Fed printed an additional $16 trillion and allocated $4 trillion from national budgets to rescue the banking sector. The flow of money in the overall economy. At this point, you might ask, why does every time the US Federal Reserve Fed raise interest rates, it triggers a widespread economic crisis? What is the rule behind global economic crises? What lies behind the shiny facade of the world financial system? To explain this, we must understand the operation of the financial system. The obvious truths are: first truth, our entire economic system is based on debt. Without debt, very little economic activity occurs. We need to borrow money to buy our homes, purchase cars, and use credit cards for holiday shopping. Second truth, so where does all this debt come from? It comes from banks. Banks print banknotes, paper money that we borrow for business operations. You might think banks lend money gradually from one person to another, but the truth is, after the gold standard where people could exchange paper money for gold and silver at specified rates was abandoned under the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971, virtually all currencies on this planet are now controlled by central banking systems. If you forge a banknote not issued by the central bank, you're committing counterfeit money, a crime punishable by imprisonment. Without central banks printing money, there would be no money in circulation. Third truth, economic development policies preached daily through media and schools often involve printing money, lowering loan interest rates to make it easier for people to borrow money for business. Economist Jeffrey Pike provided a more specific figure, mentioning that the amount of USD circulating globally is around $200 trillion, with no clear origin. Of course, money isn't pumped into the system for free. People have to pay interest, considered a reasonable cost for borrowing money. We've mentioned three obvious truths. Now, with these three truths, we reach the great paradox of the banking system: interest rates. To grasp this grand paradox, let's look at the circulation process of a banknote within the overall economy. Step 1. Suppose a person borrows $10 billion from a bank. The bank issues $10 billion in banknotes to the borrower at a 5% interest rate, and the borrower is required to repay both the principal and the interest within a specified time frame. Step 2. The borrower circulates the $10 billion in banknotes through buying and selling goods. The banknotes are circulated, moving from the original borrower to others, such as paying wages, purchasing raw materials, paying taxes, etc. The cycle continues, passing from one person to another, but the $10 billion in banknotes remain a debt that the public owes the central bank at a 5% interest rate. Step 3. On the repayment day, the borrower must repay the principal amount of $10 billion plus $500 million in interest, 5% of $10 billion. The question arises, where does the $500 million come from when the banking system only printed $10 billion in banknotes? Where does the $500 million come from? There are only two ways for the borrower to repay the $500 million. Either they bring real gold and silver or banknotes previously convertible into gold and silver to exchange. But in reality, no one today uses gold or silver or gold certificates to repay the bank. Answer: the second way is required. Someone must borrow $500 million from the central bank at a 5% interest rate to run a business. Then through buying and selling transactions, they provide the $500 million to repay the original loan. In reality, many people keep borrowing from the central bank with different amounts, often exceeding $500 million, but as long as people keep borrowing from the bank, the interest payments can be made. This creates a perpetual debt cycle with no end, as there is never enough money printed to fully repay all debts. This is not a fabrication. On May 21, 2015, economist Michael Snyder pondered how the US could repay a debt exceeding $58 trillion and discovered a horrifying truth. The US does not have enough money to repay because the US M3 money supply is only about $17 trillion. The amount of money printed is always less than the amount needed to repay debts. That's the true nature of the financial system. Mathematically impossible to repay all debts. According to the 2017 Global Debt Monitor report by the Institute of International Finance (IIF), global debt reached a record $217 trillion by the end of March 2017, equivalent to 327% of the world's GDP. In other words, we could hold on to every single product and service produced on the entire planet this year, next year, and the year after, and still not have enough to repay all debts. These are debts from households, governments, businesses, and financial firms. Countries borrow by issuing government bonds. The private sector borrows from banks and issues corporate bonds. Debt has increased from $149 trillion in 2007, 276% of GDP, to $217 trillion currently. Can we ever repay this debt? The answer is never. The US Federal Reserve, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, all are built on the same principle. Monetary easing, tightening, the true nature of global economic crises. By now, you probably understand the root cause of global financial crises. It's the operating mechanism of two successive policies easing and tightening, forming a cycle that starts with money printing and ends with financial crises. Step 1. Lowering interest rates. To stimulate economic growth, central banks lower loan interest rates, printing money so people can borrow for business operations. People are eager to borrow cheap money for buying and selling, forgetting the burden of repaying debts. Transactions occur continuously, demand exceeds normal levels due to excess money being injected, causing prices to rise, what we call inflation, resulting in economic bubbles. Step 2. Raising interest rates. When the economy enters a bubble state, to control inflation, the central bank implements measures to withdraw money from circulation and raise interest rates. Remember that the essence is that there is not enough money printed to fully repay all debts, and people must take on new debts to repay old ones. When cash is scarce and borrowing costs, interest rates are high, defaults and bankruptcies become inevitable. Who benefits from this process? The banks, because in the case of loans, if borrowers cannot repay, they must collateralize with real assets. But the sad part is that borrowers don't know their defaults are inevitable. Ultimately, the public always suffers when they have to forfeit assets to bank owners. Let's take the 1980-1988 to 1986 FED interest rate cycle as an example. After abandoning the gold standard as per the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971, the USD lost 50% of its value. To stimulate economic growth via exports, the Fed devalued the dollar by lowering interest rates, printing money to cause inflation. American export goods became cheaper compared to Germany and Japan at that time. However, in June 1981, the Fed raised interest rates to 20%, triggering the public debt crisis in Latin American countries during the 1980s. The reason was their excessive borrowing of cheap USD from the US. When the Fed raised interest rates, these countries defaulted. The crisis started in Mexico 1982 when the country declared bankruptcy, followed by most countries in the region falling into the same spiral. Argentina 1982, 1989, Bolivia 1980, 1986, 1989, Brazil 1983, 1986, 1987, and Ecuador 1982, 1984. In reality, these countries could never fully repay their debts. The FED's interest rate hikes, masked by the US economic interests, only accelerated the debt defaults of these countries. I assure you, no economists or economic professors discuss this nature with the public and students. Economic textbooks or theories serve to reinforce beliefs in the system and a form of systematic brainwashing. We are truly herd animals being led around. But this is the very unique information I want to convey to you. The US Federal Reserve (FED) is not owned by the US government. The Fed plays a crucial role in dismantling the gold standard worldwide and is privately owned, a corporation, independent and privately owned. The Fed consists of 12 regional Fed banks, each privately owned. When the world asks why the US uses a consortium of private banks to print money, the excuse given is that the government isn't wise enough. And if the government could print money, it would flood the market and destabilize it. Therefore, the Fed comprises multiple private owners to ensure a checks and balances system in money printing. However, the FED's promise of printing an infinite amount of money contradicts itself. The US dollar has depreciated by 96% since the Fed was established in 1913. That is, it's nearly worthless. A $2,000 bill today could only buy what a $100 bill did in 1913. By the 1990s, the US money supply was $7 billion, and now it's approximately $13.91 trillion. The Fed is truly a joke. The largest shareholder of the Fed is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, 53% shares. Additionally, the monetary policies the Fed implements are greatly influenced by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, as the Fed primarily deals with large banks and financial institutions in New York. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is governed by a board of directors and a president appointed by the shareholders, not elected politicians, and these shareholders are controlled by major New York banks. Citibank and JP Morgan Chase hold the majority shares. As a result, it seems there is an inner Fed controlled by New York banks, following their objectives, including providing easy credit for necessary bailout packages. The Fed's promise to print unlimited money is in stark contrast to its actual actions. The dollar has depreciated by 96% since the Fed was established in 1913. That means it is almost worthless. A $2,000 bill today only buys what a $100 bill did in 1913. The money supply has grown from $7 billion in the 1990s to approximately $13.91 trillion now. The Fed is indeed a joke. Post-1991, shift to mixed economies. After 1991, the centralized Soviet model vanished from the world. Countries that previously followed centralized economic models, like China and Russia, have transitioned to mixed economies, still market-based, but with the government controlling key industries. For example, state-owned enterprises like large shipbuilding corporations, national electric companies, and major oil and gas firms. Even in mixed economies, the primary model remains the market economy. The complexity of modern market economies. Today's market economies have become more complex as people, aided by advanced technology, can engage in various business forms. New business models like Airbnb, Uber, Grab, or Amazon have emerged in the past decade. These new models bring many benefits, but also pose more complex challenges for governments, such as income inequality, information theft, and unemployment due to automation. While these issues differ, they all revolve around the fundamental nature of resource distribution in society. This detailed exploration highlights how the Fed's interest rate policies have historically impacted global economies, the intrinsic role of debt in our financial systems, and the ongoing debate between capitalist and communist economic models. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for anyone interested in the intricacies of global finance and economic stability. This is a story about excitement, madness, and greed. It's a story about the sacred ground in the financial world known as Wall Street. This is the story of a small group of individuals who saw the slow-burning bomb named subprime mortgage bonds that Wall Street created and bet the entire market on it. They became the few who amassed great wealth while the majority lost everything. This is the story of how the entire US economy, after the bubble burst, had to undergo a credit crunch. The US government had to address the issue by printing money and stepping in to rescue Wall Street, the very entities that played a significant role in creating the bubble. Refer to parts 1 and 2 to understand more about short-term and long-term debt cycles. This is the story of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis that nearly collapsed the entire world economy. When you can't find the market, create IT. Investing well is all about being paid the right price for risk. Michael Burry, mortgage bonds, as explained in the previous video, are like a tower composed of individual mortgage loans. A mortgage loan is money borrowed to buy a house. The debts at the top repay interest first. They are safer because borrowers have good credit scores, low interest rates, and are rated AAA, indicating minimal risk. Debts at the bottom are riskier due to lower credit scores, higher default probabilities, and higher interest rates, rated from BBB to B. Subprime mortgage bonds are simply mortgage bonds comprised of numerous risky loans where borrowers are highly likely to default based on standard criteria. Banks gradually relaxed their lending standards and popularized credit by lending to individuals with high default risks. What happened was that lending standards became increasingly lax. The subprime mortgage market was born as a result. Lenders were willing to provide home loans to individuals with very questionable financial histories, unreliable credit scores, and even those without any income. If you think about it, this is quite strange. Borrowers would do anything to secure the loan they needed, while lenders should impose strict conditions to ensure they wouldn't face defaults. But this wasn't happening in 2003-2004. Credit was being crazily extended, making it easy for individuals who couldn't repay to access mortgage loans effortlessly. One plausible explanation is that these lenders weren't truly reckless or foolish, but if they were, they wouldn't be working on Wall Street. The most logical explanation is that subprime mortgage lenders weren't the ones holding these bombs, they were selling them to others. The end buyers of subprime mortgage bonds had no idea they were purchasing slow-burning bombs. A slow-burning bomb is expanding, but not everyone can see it. One of the exceptions was Michael Burry. Michael predicted the collapse of the housing market in 2003-2004 by reading a series of documents over 100 pages long, detailing various subprime mortgage bonds. Michael understood that lending standards were disastrously declining and that at some point in the future, when default rates exceeded a certain threshold, the entire housing market would collapse. It was only a matter of time. The only thing missing from Michael's strategy was a financial instrument he could use to place his bet. After searching everywhere but finding nothing, he realized the market didn't exist, or market where people believed that subprime mortgage bonds would eventually implode. He came up with the idea of credit default swaps for the subprime mortgage market. Essentially, a credit default swap is like insurance against the risk of default. Example, suppose you buy a credit default swap for company at a price of $500 annually for 10 years, with insurance coverage of $200,000 if company A defaults. If you believe that within the next 10 years, company A will default, you place a bet by purchasing the credit default swap. Paying $500 for 10 years totals $5,000, the maximum you can lose if you're wrong. However, if you're correct and company A defaults in any of those 10 years, you earn $200,000. The reason for the significant discrepancy is that the housing market was trusted absolutely by major Wall Street financial institutions in the early stages of the forming bubble. The housing market was believed to be invulnerable in 2004, and the general economy trusted it wholeheartedly. If you seek information through mainstream media like TV or newspapers, you have strong confidence in the housing market, thinking it only goes up and cannot go down. You wouldn't see the bubble forming unless you took the time to read a stack of detailed documents over 100 pages about mortgage bonds. Someone like Michael Burry clearly understood what was really happening better than those who relied on mainstream media for information. A large portion of current housing demand at current prices would disappear if only people became convinced prices weren't rising. Michael Burry, 2003. Credit default swaps for the subprime mortgage market were created by Michael Burry, who directly requested to major U.S. banks to create this financial instrument so he could place his bet on the housing market's collapse. Essentially, Michael Burry bet against the U.S. housing market. Well done, Michael. Building on financial holy ground, money never sleeps, at least on Wall Street. Financial institutions on Wall Street are some of the oldest and craftiest players in the market, so names like Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley would never admit to directly selling credit default swaps on the market. Doing so would be like carrying bombs and praying they don't explode. No, the clever Wall Street veterans have smarter strategies. Through sophisticated agreements and tricks, Wall Street financial institutions convinced an American insurance company, American International Group Inc., with vast resources, to take on all the risk the direct sellers of credit default swaps. The Wall Street foxes simply created the credit default swap market and earned intermediary fees. One of the legendary jokes in finance is, the harder you make clients understand your field, the easier you make money from them. Wall Street masters use complex terminology to describe very straightforward issues. Examples include FICO scores, creditworthiness, mortgage tranches, layers of mortgage bonds, financial derivatives, financial agreements, and the creation of collateralized debt obligations (CDOs) during the housing bubble formation period. CDOs can be considered the most sophisticated scam designed by Wall Street wolves, with most people not understanding what a CDO truly is when it first appeared. How do CDOs operate? CDOs operate similarly to mortgage bonds. If mortgage bonds are towers composed of individual mortgage loans ranked by risk from low AAA to high B, then CDOs are towers composed of different layers of mortgage bonds. If mortgage bonds and CDOs function similarly, then what purpose do CDOs serve? Answer: CDOs were created to scam uninformed buyers. Essentially, B bonds are harder to sell than AAA bonds because they are riskier. Borrowers are more likely to default. At some point during this madness, a Wall Street youth had a brilliant scam idea. If somehow B bonds could be rated as AAA bonds, life would be so much better. CDOs were created to perform this task by packaging the risky layers B bonds of various mortgage bonds into a new tower comprised entirely of B bonds and convincing rating agencies like S&P to rate them AAA. Think of it this way: Wall Street collects junk, which no one wants to buy, but Wall Street wants to sell it. The only way is to turn junk into diamonds. Wall Street packages this junk and labels it as CDOs to make it appear valuable, convincing rating agencies that these CDOs are not a pile of junk but diamonds. Rating agencies declare these CDOs as diamonds, and others believe them because they don't understand what CDOs are, and if experts vouch for them, they trust the ratings. Wall Street successfully turned junk into diamonds, making money effortlessly. Moreover, Wall Street took this a step further with the creation of synthetic CDOs. Watch the video below to understand more details about synthetic CDOs. Start at 320. Synthetic CDOs are CDOs primarily composed of credit default swaps and other derivatives. Synthetic CDOs were created to increase the number of Wall Street gamblers and the size of the entire betting table. Now, the market has two completely opposite products: CDOs comprising subprime mortgage bonds and synthetic CDOs comprising credit default swaps. Wall Street gamblers use synthetic CDOs as side baits with their own agreed-upon terms, baits based on the outcomes of the original baits, and then side baits of side baits, synthetic CDOs betting on other synthetic CDOs, etc. With one original bet of $1 million, the market can grow to $1 billion or even much larger, depending on the speed of synthetic CDO creation. This is also how credit is created during the expanding bubble period. Financial products like credit default swaps, CDOs, and synthetic CDOs are used as tools to maximize profits for Wall Street financial institutions, but come with enormous risks associated with the subprime mortgage market, as it exponentially increases credit at an unprecedented rate for the riskiest segments of the economy. With synthetic CDOs, one original bet with a certain amount of money has the potential to become a massive bet beyond the entire financial system's control, and it will explode like an atomic bomb with just a few borrowers deciding to default. But the question is, when will these inherently unloanable borrowers decide to default? As explained in parts 1 and 2, the delay can only continue as long as income growth outpaces credit growth. In the booming housing market back then, home prices only went up, and no one thought prices would ever decline. Everyone from all classes participated in the housing market as a form of investment. The subprime mortgage market developed rapidly. As home prices continuously rose alongside the growth of the subprime mortgage market, asset values increased similarly to income growth. Borrowers with soaring home values had their borrowing capacity and credit limits increased, allowing them to borrow more from banks to repay old debts or withdraw a new mortgage loan to buy a new house. These new loans were used to repay old loans, continuously repeating through refinancing contracts. allowing an individual with insignificant income to own 3 to 4 houses by continuously borrowing mortgage loans, using the increased value of house 1 to withdraw a new mortgage loan for house 2, and repeating this indefinitely. A chaotic cycle exists simply because the housing market was steadily increasing during the bubble formation years. What will happen when house prices stop rising? The first to predict the housing market collapse, Michael Burry. Michael Burry wrote in 2003, a large portion of current housing demand at current prices would disappear if only people became convinced prices weren't rising. When people realized that someone with a modest income owning 3 to 4 houses was absurd. When they understood that all these houses were assets built on incredibly widespread credit only, then would people see the bubble forming. When house prices stop rising, people will realize the bubble's formation, and the debts trapped within this bubble have nothing but houses. Without the ability to refinance, borrowers have no income sources to repay old debts and are forced to default. This happened around early 2007, as the market began to hear the beeping of the bomb when default rates spiked dramatically. A large portion of current housing demand at current prices would disappear if only people became convinced prices weren't rising. Michael Burry 2003. When credit is created, one person's debt becomes another's asset. When the financial housing market is tightly interconnected, one borrower's default leads to a chain reaction of other borrowers being unable to pay, creating a domino effect in a tightly linked system. Naturally, banks during this period were not foolish enough to hold on to piles of risky subprime mortgage bonds that could implode like fireworks. Banks had hedging packages to ensure everything remained under control in the worst-case scenario. Hedging is an investment method to minimize potential losses if the worst case happens. However, the absurd part is that Bank A's hedging package is protected by Bank B, Bank B's package is protected by Bank C, and so on. Looping back to Bank A, simply put, banks rely on each other's protection in the worst-case scenarios and reassure themselves that they are safe if the subprime mortgage market collapses. It's no surprise that when the bubble bursts, one bank's bankruptcy drags many others into crisis. The subprime mortgage market created an enormous amount of credit that, when it burst, caused the entire housing market to collapse, dragging the US and the global economy down with it. Once you create a subprime mortgage market, don't be surprised if the bubble bursts. How Wall Street scammed risk rating agencies. A guy who can't get a job on Wall Street got a job at Moody's. Said by an investor on Wall Street, from 2003 to 2007, the primary job of major Wall Street institutions was to use their unparalleled imagination to devise numerous, highly complex financial products with names that, once heard, would make you doubt your intelligence. All these new financial products served one sole purpose: to lend to high-risk borrowers, package these individual risky debts into mortgage bonds, then package the riskiest layers of mortgage bonds into CDOs, scam financial institutions by getting them rated AAA, and sell them to uninformed buyers who believe AAA signifies very safe, thereby earning immense profits from the process. When Wall Street thought of products like CDOs or synthetic CDOs, there was a truth: rating agencies like S&P or Moody's didn't have specific models to assess the risk levels of these products because it was the first time they were encountering such bizarre entities. There's a saying, those who can't get a job on Wall Street will get a job at Moody's. Those working at Moody's or other rating agencies responsible for monitoring Wall Street's activities were the ones unable to secure jobs on Wall Street. In fact, these individuals were controlled by the Wall Street wolves. The loopholes in the rating system had long been exploited by Wall Street to turn junk into diamonds. A loophole in rating systems. A loophole in the rating system for mortgage bonds, or CDOs, was that the safety level was calculated based on the average FICO scores of all the debts. FICO scores indicate the borrower's creditworthiness. The higher the score, the more trustworthy the borrower. Rating agencies assess the risk levels of mortgage bonds, or CDOs, by taking the average FICO scores of all layers in the tower without analyzing each layer individually. Wall Street exploited this loophole by creating a multitude of junk towers. For example, to achieve an average score of 10 with 6 individuals, there are two ways. 1. Scores 9, 11, 9, 11, 9, scores 5, 5, 5, 15, 15, 15. Wall Street used the second method to achieve the required average score to be rated AAA. Comparing the two methods, although both achieved the same average, the second tower is far more prone to collapse than the first. However, Wall Street still needed to find individuals with 15 FICO scores, meaning those with high FICO scores, to complete their massive scam machinery. Since high FICO scores were rare, to create a colossal scam machine, Wall Street had to invent ways to replicate numerous 15 scores. Another loophole in rating agencies was their inability to distinguish between thick FICO scores and thin FICO scores. Thick FICO scores belong to individuals with verified borrowing histories, reliable scores, while thin FICO scores are for those who haven't established a long enough borrowing history to be considered trustworthy. The easiest way to generate numerous 15 scores or high FICO score individuals was to find people who had just borrowed and had fulfilled their repayment obligations, meaning they had short borrowing histories but were given high starting FICO scores because they had already repaid their loans. Wall Street granted mortgage loans to a large number of immigrants who had no borrowing history to buy homes with very modest incomes. Although they could afford to pay interest in the short term, creating high starting FICO scores, in the long term, if house prices decreased even slightly, they would lose the ability to repay their mortgage loans. The entire financial system, from consumers to rating agencies, was spectacularly scammed by Wall Street. The credit crunch process. From 2001 to 2007, the leverage ratios of major banks skyrocketed. Bear Stearns at 40-1, Merrill Lynch at 32-1, Morgan Stanley and Citigroup at 33-1, Goldman Sachs at 25-1. Information from The Big Short by Michael Lewis. A high leverage ratio means that most of the financial institution's assets come from credit, debt. While a high leverage ratio can help maximize profits from investment deals, it is extremely dangerous. Even a slight decrease in asset values can cause financial institutions to flounder in repaying interest. Leverage ratios are always a double-edged sword. Everyone knows this, but few can resist its allure. When the bubble burst in 2008 and lasted until 2009, all major financial institutions on Wall Street plunged into crisis. Two major Wall Street banks, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, went bankrupt, while other large banks teetered on the brink. Consumer spending plummeted, people panicked, savings accounts were wiped out, and the stock market plummeted uncontrollably, creating an unprecedented crisis in history. The credit monster Wall Street Fed daily finally exploded right in its face. Credit default swaps suddenly became extremely hot commodities in the market, with institutions scrambling to auction off credit default swaps in the hope of surviving the storm. The US economy had to undergo one of the largest credit crunches in history. Mortgage debt plummeted from 2007 to 2009 due to high default rates. Default rates kept rising month after month, turning many assets into air in an instant, causing a cash crisis that led to an economic crisis. Along with the rapidly increasing default rates was the rapid decline in income, creating a dangerous cycle pushing the economy towards the brink of collapse. The US Central Bank Federal Reserve, or Fed, had to implement one of the most aggressive rescue operations in history. The Fed lowered interest rates to the lowest possible levels, bought up a large number of debts from major Wall Street banks, and stepped in to rescue the industry, of course, using taxpayers' money. In 2009, the Fed injected approximately $1.5 trillion into the economy to stimulate economic activity. The Fed did everything within its power to rescue the struggling economy. Although everything started from the subprime mortgage market on Wall Street, its consequences spread worldwide. There were countless opportunities to make money from subprime mortgages, And primarily, the end buyers were in Europe those who trusted the integrity and safety of the subprime mortgage market. The financial storm spread from the US to Europe and the rest of the world. The global financial market is a living organism with Wall Street as its central heartbeat. When Wall Street suffers, other parts inevitably face casualties, especially since banks rely on mutual protection for the worst-case scenarios. And if we die together. A financial system built on the growth of highly risky credit. While risk distribution, those who bear the consequences in the worst-case scenarios, is concentrated among a group of interdependent entities, the world's banks. When the worst-case scenario occurs, everyone holds hands and plunges into the abyss together. When the financial industry is in trouble, sooner or later, the entire economy will follow. Ethics in business, capitalism without failure is like religion without sign. Alan Meltzer. From an economic and national security perspective, the Fed was not wrong to step in and rescue the U.S. financial industry. The existence of banks during the darkest times of the economy was necessary to ensure that economic activities could recover. If you disagree, think about what would happen if major banks were allowed to fail en masse. Where would the economy drift? How would money circulate? What would happen to the financial market? However, from the taxpayer's perspective, it's akin to paying taxes to support the ignorance and greed of this industry. Wall Street caused one of the largest economic crises in history, and none of the culprits had to face jail time. Moreover, these individuals were confident that the Fed would rescue them because the Fed still steps in when the economy is in peril to save major banks on the brink of bankruptcy. This remains the age-old question: are financial institutions truly too important to fail? Some say yes, some say no, and some want to replace the entire financial industry with cryptocurrencies. Ultimately, all opinions are reasonable. This is the issue I want readers to reflect on. Are banks truly too large to fail? Regardless of your opinion, it deserves respect because no matter what you believe, I'm sure there will be someone out there who agrees with your viewpoint.